everybody. Welcome to Attendance Bias. I'm Brian Weinstein, your host, and today my guest is Chris Casey of New Hampshire, who is on to talk about his first show from November 28th, 1997 at the Worcester Centrum. This show took place toward the end of Phish's legendary 1997 Phish Destroys America Fall Tour. This was Chris's first show, and I'm so glad that he picked it because, number one, I've never listened to it straight through before, and number two, there is a pristine soundboard recording of it available on phish.in. I highly recommend you go on to check it out. Chris and I have been friends for years, but we've never attended a show together, although through conversation we found out that we have been to many shows at the same time, although we've been there separately. In today's episode, Chris and I talk about the scene outside the Worcester Centrum in 1997, the slew of new songs from that year, and whether or not you should be pleased with a My Soul encore. Throughout today's episode, there are a few small technical glitches, which tends to happen when we do remote recordings, so I appreciate your understanding and listening as we discuss all of these awesome topics. But enough from me, let's go to Chris as we talk about November 28th, 1997 at the Worcester Centrum. Chris, welcome to Attendance Bias. Thank you for agreeing to be on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brian.
You picked a really excellent show. I just listened to it again today, and it took me back like a time travel machine back to 1997 when I first saw the band. On your re-listens, what were your first thoughts? And then we'll get into a little bit more about who you are, why you're here, etc.
You know, it was really fun listening back to it. I think there's an energy to it that it's more prevalent back then across the board. Like we get glimpses of it now and again in like the current shows that are out there because it's been a minute since I've actually listened to the show.
Oh, all right. This will be interesting because I just listened to it right before I pressed record on this conversation. So I'm excited to remind you of things and to hear your recollection of things as we move forward. But before we get to the show itself, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from?
I am from the southwest corner of New Hampshire, just right around Keene, New Hampshire. I work in the education system. I got a little fun side gig working at a beer store, and I'm into trail running, playing guitar, and making art.
Well, so you said you're from the southwest corner of New Hampshire. Is that where you grew up or where you're living now or both?
I've been out here for roughly 20 years. Previous to that, I was just about an hour further east in the state since the time I was 8. And before that, I was living in Pennsylvania.
So you mentioned your interest and you talked about being an artist. That's something I wanted to ask just a little bit about. Your art persona, I guess, or your tag, whatever you want to call it, is
it's just the name I use.
The name you use is Montroller. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I kind of wanted, at least for the name, something that didn't directly identify me, but more spoke to the work of art or the works of art that I would put out. And most of the art that I do is it's like a modernish kind of nature blended with a street art background kind of flavor. And the encompassing theme seems to be the birds that I've done repeatedly throughout all of the paintings.
And what media is it? Or what media are you most comfortable or usually working in?
Generally, it's acrylics on canvas.
All right. And where could people find Montroller work if they're interested in checking it out?
If you just look up Montroller on Instagram, there will be a whole bunch of stuff there. And I apparently also have a Weebly site, which has some of the other stuff. There's a going rumor. I believe my girlfriend put the site together, but it's one of the Weebly sites utilizing Montroller somewhere in the URL.
And it seems like Instagram is the place to find it.
Yeah, Instagram's generally the most up-to-date stuff because I'll work on something, take a picture of it, and then it's there.
All right, so it's Montroller, right?
Yeah. Yes.
All right, excellent. And how long have you been working on that?
Uh, I've been doing art stuff my entire life, but the Montroller thing has probably been a good 15 years now.
Compared to how long have you been seeing fish?
That's 23 years.
All right, so art follows art, I guess.
Yeah.
So the show at Worcester, November 28th, 97 was your first show, right? Before we get into fish and before we get into that show specifically, where were you or who were you in 1997? If you think back to Chris Casey 23 years ago, who was he? What was he into?
I was a freshman in college. I was into music. I liked checking stuff out. I hadn't been to a tremendous amount of live shows just in general across the board at that point. So like this was a new, like exciting experience.
To give you a little bit of background and context, just so you remember, 1997 musically, as I saw it, was kind of a transition year between like popular hard rock grunge of the mid 90s, like stuff that like whether it's Nirvana or Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots, that whole scene. And then I felt like the later suburban hip hop and bubblegum pop, like boy bands, for example, of the late 90s. So just to bring you back, some of the biggest songs of the year in 1997 were Mbop by Hanson, I'll Be Missing You by Puff Daddy, Semi-Charmed Life by Third Eye Blind, Barbie Girl by Aqua, and Walking on the Sun by Smash Mouth was gigantic.
What an age we lived in.
Right? When I was looking at it, it's just all over the place.
Yeah, and it's like one of those things, yeah, when you go with what's popular, I mean, out of that group, you can say like what really lasted like the test of time on that. I mean, there's some of them we can remember, but did anything last out of that?
Well, Puff Daddy's still around. Right? I'll Be Watching You was gigantic. People still know B.I.G.
Right.
You know, like that has the biggest legacy, I would think.
You could say the Hanson song, I guess. You know, that will forever be remembered by a certain segment of people as like it was almost like a cheesy kind of pop thing at the time.
And just for contrast, so in 1997, I was a sophomore in high school, so I was a couple years behind you. I was deep still into my classic rock phase, but I was generally open to anything with guitar and loud drums. One of my friends at the time was getting really deep into the Grateful Dead. This was like a big transition for us. He was getting deep into the Grateful Dead and the Doors. Those were his two favorites. Another friend of mine was getting big into Radiohead. Let's not forget, OK Computer came out in 1997.
Yep.
So his big bands were Radiohead and Pink Floyd was his deep dive. And for me, The Who were my favorite band ever. And it seemed like nobody had dibs on Fish.
Yeah, it was still a free reign then. You know, it was for the taking.
Well, amongst my friends especially, because no one I knew was into Fish at all. And so they were next on my list. That summer of 1997, so right before this show, that's when I really dug into them. I heard a picture of Nectar on a ride actually to New Hampshire. I was in a summer camp and we were going camping in the White Mountains.
Okay.
And on the way there, the counselor who was driving put on a picture of Nectar. And it was Glide that grabbed me. So when I got home that summer, that's the first album I bought. It was the day after I got home from camp. And I bought a picture of Nectar, and that was etched into my DNA throughout the rest of the year. And so I knew that album back and forth, but I didn't have really any live stuff yet. So if you were going to see Fish in this fall, what was your experience at?
So I had initially first heard Hoist, and it didn't really grab me, though. Like I had heard it talked about and the band talked about and held in such high esteem. And these people were pretty much just talking the live shows and just how fire they were. And I didn't know much about them. I'm like, all right, let's check this out. And I happened to get Hoist. And it didn't stick with me. Like, the music was so different from what I had been listening to that I didn't know how to connect with it. And there was like a lot of themes in it where I'm like, are we kind of going Christian rock on this? You know, like Life Boy or something. I'm like, I don't know what to make of this. And so it just kind of sat dormant for a bit. I did end up getting a live one, which I was listening to actually today when I was driving around. And what spoke to me about that one was that live element, and like Page's, like just the grand piano on that has this completely elegant feel to it. And it just gives such a richness to the music. And that really made me a lot more interested.
Which tracks were you listening to? Like, what do you mean when you say Page's grand piano? When you say that, I think Slave to the Traffic Light, but what were you thinking?
There was like, it's prevalent on a lot of the songs, but I remember just like the Squirming Coil outro.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
There's just so much great work there. Yeah, the Slaves on that one. And it just seemed to be, versus what I had heard on Hoist, there was just so much more to that live performance. Even though, you weren't, well, Dumbo does have the horns on it there.
That's true, that's right.
Yeah, just the production of Hoist, where it's like, oh, we got backup singers and we have horns and all that. I think the live experience just made it that much better. And, there's still some stuff. There's like those parts of, what's called Montana, which
was that a tweezer, right?
Yeah, that was a tweezer jam. And then the tweezer itself gets into those really kind of niche jam spots where you're like, this is just getting weird. And for a first-time listener, you might kind of like draw back from that a little bit, but it was so much fun to go back and listen to today and just see how they work through that stuff.
Sure. I remember reading an article. I don't remember if it was Rolling Stone. It may have been, or it may have been in the Fish biography. I can't remember, but someone refers to Fish as a musical litmus test. It's like they go everywhere and do so much that what you can grab from it kind of reflects on your own tastes, because there's going to be something you don't like eventually and possibly a lot that you'll love. So it's kind of like, where do you stand? Because they'll do anything. And those tweezers from like 94 and also 95 speak to that, I think.
Yeah, no, that is true. Sometimes you just get into the kind of those weird, like avant-garde kind of areas with those jams. And sometimes they're just like going for the money on it, just machine gun tray riffs and just peeking out into these different levels where that's going to be maybe a lot easier to draw certain people in. People like me would definitely gravitate to that. It takes me a little bit longer when I was younger to work through those things that were just a little bit more obscure.
Well, I wanted to ask, and then we'll move on to the show, what did draw you in? Like, what was like your first favorite song, or what song were you hoping to hear at your first concert?
So at the point of the first show, I didn't necessarily have like a favorite. Once I had gotten into school, like I had a couple guys that like lived in my dorm that had a whole boatload of tapes. And I remember listening to those while hanging out with them. I didn't really have like any time where I was sitting directly with the music, just taking it in like while driving or anything, but it would be on the background in rooms and stuff. And I remember really liking 2001 and Funky Bitch at the time. Like those were the two. I'm like, I'd like to hear one of those.
All right. So let's move into your first show, the show for today, November 28th, 1997 at the Worcester Centrum. Looking back at 1997, Fish played 81 shows, which seems crazy today in 2020. They played a winter European tour, the end of which was famously captured on Slip, Stitch, and Pass. The very end of that tour, I think it was the second to last date of that tour. They played another European tour in the early summer, and then they played a late summer tour in the U.S. that culminated in The Great Went. And then to wrap up the year, they played a much celebrated fall tour, Fish Destroys America. And to end the whole thing, a 4-show holiday run that ended at Madison Square Garden. So that was a very big year for Fish.
That was a solid year.
That was more, I looked it up, and they played more shows in 97 than they did in 98, 99, or 2000.
Yeah, they put the legwork in that year, and it definitely shows.
Yeah, and when we go into the show, we'll talk about, I took some notes how many times certain songs were played in that calendar year, and it's mind-blowing, but we'll get to those.
Yeah.
So this show, November 28th, 97, is the day after Thanksgiving. It's that Friday. So who were you with? What was your pre-show like? How did you end up with a ticket to this show?
I didn't know I was going until the day before. My sister got a phone call while we were sitting down having Thanksgiving dinner from a friend of hers who worked at Strawberries, which was like the local tape CD, get your tickets for concerts place, hang out at midnight to get album releases. But her friend had these tickets, couldn't go, so just asked if she wanted them. And my sister is nowhere near the type of person that's into Fish or whatever, but she was like, sure, whatever, we'll go check it out. So it was me and her and my friend Matt, and we drove down to the Centrum the next day.
And so from New Hampshire, right, to Worcester.
Yep, about an hour.
So when I picture Worcester, and I've been to Worcester several times, but almost always in the summer. I very rarely have been to Massachusetts in general in any other season because I worked at that summer camp I told you about earlier, which was in Massachusetts, near Worcester, actually. But when I think of Worcester, I always picture it as being kind of this desolate, industrial, but also cold and snowy city. I don't know why. Like I said, I've only been there in the summer, but whenever I've heard of fans talk about a Worcester show, it always seems like it was cold. They always talk about how cold it is outside. Is that accurate, or am I just kind of putting it in my mind's eye and I'm way off?
No, it can definitely be that way. You think about, the Centrum is an indoor venue, and you're typically doing the indoor venues during a fall or winter run. So it's just, there's no lot there. It's just kind of like an out front, like concrete pavilion area in the front. And that's kind of the congregation scene besides like a couple parking garages. But Worcester isn't exactly the kind of place that you want to be hanging out in a lot of areas. So basically you just get there, you're on the concrete pavilion out in front, and that's it until you're inside.
When you say that, it reminds me of the Pepsi Arena or the Knickerbocker in Albany. It kind of has that, lots of garages around, but almost like there's not much to do around there, and it's a big crowd that congregates outside as opposed to a parking lot.
Right, like at Pepsi, they just block off the road, at least the times I've been there, and it's just a hangout out in the street.
So you're with your sister and a friend, you said?
Yes.
Okay, what's the friend's name? Matt. Okay, let's invite him. So Matt's with us now. So you're with your sister and Matt. You walk in. I've never been to the Worcester Centrum. Like, what is it like? How big is it, would you guess? Are there any other venues you would compare it to, like aesthetically?
It's a very typical, minor league hockey team type arena. Maybe you're putting 15,000 in there if I'm making a quality guesstimate on that. Not super large, but not tiny. I know like up in Maine, Cumberland County Civic Center's significantly smaller. I want to say that one's maybe like 8,000-9,000, maybe 12 if I'm pushing it.
If you're brave enough to drive all the way up there to see Fish, it better be worth it.
It's not as far as you'd think.
Yeah, it's in Portland, right? I've never been.
Right.
The CCCC.
Yeah, and I love it because it's all general admission. At least that's how it used to be.
Oh, I love venues like that, like Hampton or Charleston is like that as well. I love those. Yep. All right, so you're in there. You're sitting where?
We are probably on like this one of like the first tiers up, first or second tier up, which is I want to say they were still going in the line. So I think we were like Fishman side at that point, like to the band's right, kind of most of the way back.
Okay.
So I had a fair view of the arena and the band.
Oh, great. And the lights.
Yes.
Great. Okay, lights go down and the curtain opens, and then in the 2-hole is You Enjoy Myself right away. This is an unbelievable 1-2 punch.
Right. And I rolled into the show knowing I wasn't going to know a whole lot of what's going on, which is part of, the history of this band and what makes it fun. And it's what was going to make it exciting for me. Like, because if I just heard every song I already knew, I don't feel it would be as fun. Like, I wanted to get something new out of this. And so the curtain was new to me. I had never heard it before. I'm like, okay, this is cool. Like, we're working our way through it, and I enjoyed it.
And you were lucky because
then we roll right into Yem.
Yeah. And you're lucky because I looked it up. The curtain was only played 3 times in 1997. It's still a rarity, but it was also a rarity back then.
Right.
And You Enjoy Myself was 24 minutes long.
Yeah, and I mean, when they got through it and they got to the jam, they picked up like the let's do it immediately.
Yeah, they were patient in this show as they were in every show that year, but a lot of the songs I thought as a running theme, they just kind of got through the songs and they went right into the jam. When we get to Timber Ho, I mean, that's later, that's in the second set, but the song portion is 2 minutes long and the jam is like 14 minutes. So they started right away with that mentality. You Enjoy Myself right up front.
Right. And they get into that jam and it just starts going in all the directions that jams from 97 are known for. Because you're getting in there, you're getting Cross-Eyed and Painless teases in there, just
that's
like
right.
The funk jams. And then you're just going back into like just full on just rocking exploration.
Yeah, I wrote similar things in my notes with, first of all, Cross-Eyed and Painless, I'm guessing is the most teased song in all of Phish history. I feel like every 1 out of every 3 shows I go to, something like Weekapaw Groove or something has Cross-Eyed teases. But I wrote that around 14 minutes, they slip into a jazzy, slow groove as if they have all the time in the world.
When your second song and first set, you do have all the proverbial time in the world.
True. All right. So they also do some stop-start jamming toward the end of the song right away. So you are in it deep. And after You Enjoy Myself, they go straight into I Didn't Know from the vocal jam.
The vocal jam's real short in that, because they basically are using that I Didn't Know as the vocal section.
Right. It takes its place because I Didn't Know is only about 4 minutes long, and that's about as long as the vocal jam typically is. So I wanted to ask, do you remember any of that when Fishman plays the vacuum during I Didn't Know?
I do, and I just remember thinking, I'm like, they literally will do anything. And it's not necessarily, I'm like, it was kind of like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. And it wasn't terribly long, but it was just interesting. And then you're just moving right along.
Yeah. It was just part of the course because you're still at the very beginning of the show. Right. And I noticed for the first time today when I listened that there was a fuck your face reference in I Didn't Know, where Trey he introduces Fishman to come up and do the vacuum, and he introduces him as Henrietta to give you his interpretation of the Rolling Stones' Sucking in the 70s album.
Oh, that is true.
And that was at a point, they didn't play Fuck Your Face again until Dick's in 2012? Like that was...
Yeah, it was a while.
That was right in the middle of this fuck your face hiatus. So it was never out of mind. So then after that, we got The Curtain, You Enjoy Myself, I Didn't Know, and then Maze, which is, in my opinion, the centerpiece of this set.
Oh, yeah. Like, I mean, that's where you're like, we're going to go deep. And I just remember watching that, just being amazed. Just like feeling like you're actually in like the thick of the show and like figuring out what's going on around you. Being like, this is what people are talking about.
Yeah. And it's nowadays we see that Fish kind of, they build, like they've become, and Trey, I think in particular, has become an expert at the construction of a show, the blueprint of how to build, how to rest, how to close very strong, how to open with a surprise. Like he's very good at placement. Back then in 97, and I think this is true for almost the whole year, if not for starting in the summer tour in the US, they just go pedal to the metal the whole way. Like there's no warming up involved.
No, and I think that is a product of, like you're saying, they had played more shows that year than any other year. They're developing this new kind of funk thing that they're doing. Their jams are going in a different direction, and they've got a group of songs that they're bringing out on the road that are really fresh to everybody at that point.
Yeah.
So there's like a lot of excitement in their playing, and they want to be out there to get those out there and just do this new thing they're into.
Yeah, and speaking of new songs, after Maze was Farmhouse, which was debuted earlier that year on the Conan O'Brien show.
Yeah, and I remember just thinking like how different, song after song, the feel of each of them is uniquely different from the one before it. And that's no different, where you get more of like a melodic ballad out of Farmhouse, or a little slower tempo. And I just remember I didn't know what it was, but I really enjoyed it for what it was.
Yeah, I even wrote that down. I wrote style backlash or style whiplash. That, when you go from Maze, which closed at the end, it kind of has a part at the end of Maze. I know we're talking about Farmhouse, but at the end, there's kind of this moving back and forth between dissonance and then awesome coherent guitar lines, almost like at the very end of David Bowie. There's a part in Maze that does that too. And then to follow that up with what you said, like a very sweet, easy 4/4 melodic Farmhouse, that's like whiplash, made in a good way. I love it.
Right. And I think that's what's going to keep you interested in it. Like, I know that kept my interest. It's like, we're doing the next thing. It's different than the last thing. And you can assume that the thing coming after it is also going to be different.
Yeah, well, it absolutely is, because after Farmhouse, they played Eyed Katy, which is gone now, or at least transformed or adapted.
Yes,
now.
The wordless Moma Dance.
Right, the prototype Moma Dance, where they developed it, I think, in Europe. And by the time they got back to America, it was kind of this stretched out song that is kind of one of the, quote, excuse for the band to play a funk groove as long as they want category. It's just like you could say
right.
Tweezer is little more than an excuse to jam. Nothing against Tweezer, but it's not exactly a deep song. It's there for them to improvise. It's a springboard. You could say the same thing about Eyed Katy, but for funk.
Right. And this was just early on, before you had any vocals with it. So the structure of the song is still there for what became Moma Dance, but it's just all instrumental, and they're just taking that opportunity to take a deep dive into that new genre that they're all just getting into and loving at that point. And so, maybe it's just more gratuitous funk playing, because you had a bunch going through Yem, but it's continually, which is the theme of that 97, like going back into that.
And a running theme is also how slow and relaxed they sound. Even From the Curtain was played at a slower tempo, but Black Eyed Katy really emphasizes it because it's slow, it's tight, and you could just, if you were dancing to it, you'd even be moving really slow. It's a slow jam.
Slow jams.
Slow jams with a Z.
Yeah. And, I just think like when you get funk, like when you can really slow funk down, there's something just a little bit meatier about it where you like, it's just something a little bit more that will really pull you in. And if it can get really good, that it doesn't get better than that.
I agree. It's my favorite. But you talked about these new songs earlier. So they had Farmhouse, Black Eyed Katy, and then Theme from the Bottom, which was also new for 1997. Right. I mean, no, that's not true. They played it in 1995. They debuted it. But when I think the Lowell Voters for Choice show. But I looked it up, and Theme from the Bottom, it wasn't new in 1997, but they played it 27 times that year.
You just can't, you can't not like that.
Yeah, it's very much a psychedelic rock song, Theme from the Bottom is, and they had mastered it by this year and by this show for sure. And to close it out, they played Rocky Top, which is, I thought, kind of interesting placement. It's usually in the beginning of a set or usually an encore. But as a set closer, I thought that was interesting because it leaves everyone upbeat and rocking. And I also noticed in this, maybe it's the mix of the soundboard recording, that Page was very prevalent in this. Rocky Top,
Yeah, and again, out of the songs that I knew, this show only had 2 songs I knew the entire time. And I hadn't heard anything else they had actually done in the bluegrass style. So like I was saying, something different after something different. Here we go with the bluegrass number, totally different. And it's a really good song.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's another thing. Just drew me right in. I'm like, we're doing something different, and this is really cool. Like, I wouldn't have expected this.
So where were you at set break? I mean, it was your first show is 23 years ago. So who knows?
Right.
But if you don't remember then what set break was like, I don't remember set break at my first show.
I couldn't tell you what happened at that set break.
Well, when you look back now, though, then as a more seasoned fan, what are your impressions of this first set?
I think it's a winner of a set. Like, I would be more than thrilled to hear that at any other show. I don't think there were any low points. There weren't any things where you're like, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know about that placement. Everything was solid. I'm really happy with it, even listening back to it.
All right, so now let's go into set 2 of the show. November 28th, 1997 at the Worcester Centrum. Set 1 closed with Rocky Top. Sit through set break, lights go down, and they open with Timber Ho, which is, when I look back, kind of a revival of sorts. It was this song in 1997 that they played 8 times, and that's not a tremendous amount. It's not nothing.
That's like 7 times more than they play it per year now.
Yeah, right. I mean, but they brought it back in 2009, but we'll get there in a sec. But when you look it up on the spreadsheet, Timber Ho, and you look at specifically in 1997, they played it 8 times. I think 7 of them have notes as being on, quote, the jam chart, having like notable versions to listen to, including this one.
Yeah, and this song, it made, I don't know rhythmically what it was. Like, it's like a dark, dissonant kind of jam when it goes in, but it just made this massive impression on me. And I was sold on this song. It became my license plate for a number of years. But that jam, it goes into these dark, meandering, kind of subdued things, and then it breaks out into kind of, as I remember, like these like fiery kind of like Machine Gun Trey riffs. And there's moments of, when you've been in these tours, like thematically band members pick up on what each other are doing. And so when I think about like the 12/6 Tweezer Isabella from like a week later, where that's just a historically epic jam, there's elements of what's in that jam, like just a little bite size, like fun size candy bar size, little snippets of them doing stuff where you're like, oh yeah, that's it. Now we've moved on. So like it was building in there, and like it was really cool to go back and listen to that, because even like the song, like the next night, the Runaway Gym, that's near an hour.
Yeah, the famous Runaway Jam.
Yeah, you're like, oh wait, there's more of that in there. So this was definitely really cool to see how these building blocks progress to something so epic.
So was this the one that got you, that sold you for life? Would you this Timber Ho, or was it just confirmation?
I mean, that timbre was really good. I mean, I think that like the really selling it to me came later in the show.
Mm-hmm.
So,
all right, we'll get there.
We'll get to that.
But when you talked about the Timber Ho, I also wrote that there's lots of dissonance, and almost this section toward the end where there's like competing rhythms between the band members, but it still holds together. And when you brought up that they don't play it anymore, I remember in 2009 when they brought back Timber Ho, the first time I heard it was at a Jones Beach show in 2009 at the very beginning of their tour. And I expected it to be this like, oh my God, we're in for it now. And it was like 3 minutes long, as was the case in 2009. But I think I had that expectation because of versions like this in 1997, because it had this reputation. And that's what 2009 was very much about.
Right.
It was kind of a recital in a way, like let's touch on everything we've ever done.
Yeah. But when you're going back to these, like this is why some of those songs that we're hoping for to come back, why you want to hear them, because when they did them originally, it was fire.
Right. And including the next song, Limb by Limb, after Timber Ho, which, again, how many new songs were played at this show? New in quotes at the time they were. And I looked it up, and Limb by Limb was played 23 times in 1997.
Yeah, I mean, that was another one out of that batch that they were excited about, and clearly the playing on that, matched the excitement. Even though they've done it that many times, they were into it. And
yeah, it was there. And it's Limb by Limb. It's like a playground for each band member. They're so in control of their instrument and their creativity in the song. It's so joyous. And even this year, when in 2020, for example, it takes a while for the audience to come around on certain songs and for the band to really break in and feel certain songs. That in 1997 was kind of less the case, just because of percentages, just because of numbers. They just played them so often that by the time we get to the end of the fall tour where this show is, it's like an old favorite. Let's just tear it apart, even though we debuted it less than a year ago.
Right. Yeah, and there's a few things like that. And I think at that time, depending on what the song was, people were receptive to it.
Yeah.
When you go to like the encore, like the My Soul, I liked it, but apparently everyone else had already heard it 30,000 times, and it didn't necessarily, people were good with having heard it once or twice.
And now it's a rarity.
Yeah.
I don't remember the last time I heard My Soul. And they might have played it in Mexico, but I don't quite remember. That's a little hazy. But speaking of hazy, we're in the middle of the second set. So we go from Limb by Limb to Slave to the Traffic Light, which is another odd placement, like I thought Rocky Top was. Slave is the ultimate closer, right? I mean, whether it's an encore or a second set. And it's in the middle of the second set. And even I was listening on my headphones earlier today to prepare for this, and I even thought that we were at the end of the show. I've been brainwashed.
Right. It always seems to fill that role. And sometimes there's those traditional songs, like maybe like a Harry Hood. Sometimes you're like, oh, we hit the hood. Like we're going to close out this set. And then you get more stuff. I loved hearing this because this was the second of the two songs I actually knew, the first one being Yem. But, this was really great because I was already sold on like the piano work from Paige, which I was really excited to hear. Just something to listen to from the context of I already know this, so like I want to see what this is like live.
Yeah, and that's very interesting because when you're a traditional music fan, when you go see a show by any given band, definitely you want to see the songs like the sing-alongs. That's how the straight world goes to see live music, right? But the thing about Phish is you want to hear things you've never heard before. That's the whole allure of it.
Right. Why would you go every night?
Exactly. And this Slave actually gave me some pretty fun thoughts in that I recently recorded an episode the other day about a show from 1999. And one of the things from 1999 that's at least the show that stood out to me was their control of dynamics, the band's control of dynamics, their ability to facilitate between super hard edge, crazy speed rock and very spacey, ambient, slow, abstract jams and things like that. And it was like they never lost control of it. It was perfect. But in 1997, I felt like there was so fewer dynamics. They were just supercharged 100%.
No, that was the thing. Like they were excited about playing. There was that supercharged, let's just go tear it apart attitude. But sometimes then I think that funk thing was almost a tool to be able to like, if we can slow it down, we can draw back on that like 0 to 60 mentality and play slower in a way that's more applicable to us now rather than just kind of getting maybe ambient and kind of abstract or whatnot. Like this is going to be slower, but keep people more involved.
Well, that's what I think Slave did in the middle, in the build toward the end, when it seems they were supercharged the whole show, and then Slave kind of brings them down to the ground again so that they can build up, right, and have that triumphant coda.
I think it was that Slave where even in like the beginning of it, like there's still some like weird, like couple measure breaks where it's almost like Funk Siren or something, like not quite, but it's just kind of breaking down a little bit. Like Paige has something that's totally unique to the song, and then it just rolls back into what everyone knows as Slave.
And
Like
then
it was definitely getting out there in those segments.
And then after it ends, there's no rest for the weary because Ghost starts. And this is a banner year for Ghost. Again, 28 times in 1997, they played this song, which is not quite every other show, but almost every third show. And it's so practiced, you could tell. And I had the thought listening today that if you didn't like rhythm-based funk or slap bass, like Bootsy Collins, or in this case, Mike Gordon, you got nothing for 1997. You are shit out of luck. This Ghost just goes crazy.
Right.
Well, I never listened to this show before you recommended it.
And it was great. And I mean, not only was I'm like, all right, we're revisiting that kind of the Black Eyed Katy funk jam thing from earlier, but it just went even further. And I just remember just during that, just like being so like just like zoned into the music, and then just looking around and really seeing like the light show that Kuroda can put on, where I just remember this like expanding sea of these lime green and blue circles that were just going out and panning across the crowd. And I could like, that's really where I'm like, this is it. Like, this is the shit right here. And I get what other people are talking about. Like, I understand why people are going after night, why like the people I heard talking it up are talking it up. Like, there's something really special going on.
And for people who would listen to this show, this Ghost is probably the pinnacle of the second set, either this or the Timber Ho, I would say.
Yeah.
But when you describe it that way, it's just Phish is such a sensory, visceral experience that when the band brings it like this, there's really no failing. There's nowhere to go wrong. I mean, there's a part around 9 minutes in when Trey, he's so versatile with his guitar tone. He's like razor's edge. Like, his guitar tone is so sharp.
Right. I mean, and the band's obviously comfortable in the style now. Like, they're really working on following each other around a little more rather than just let's just see what Trey's doing. And I think this is maybe a little bit more of like that early on, let's be a cohesive unit bit.
Yeah. And to close it all out after that outstanding Ghost is the all-time American #1 rock song is Johnny Be Good.
Yeah. I will tell you that is where I was sold on this band instantly.
Okay.
Because they came out of Ghost. When you listen back on the tape, you can hear like them counting off. They're still playing Ghost.
Yeah, you can hear it. Yeah.
And they go into Johnny Be Good with this ferocity, like they're never going to play another song ever again. So they're going to play this for all it's worth, take it around the block a couple times. And this is classic Machine Gun Trey. Like, I think he actually forgets the words at certain points because they're playing so fast and he's just going for it. And he's saying words he knows from the song, whether they fit in that spot, I'm not sure, which seems to be the case for some of these Johnny Be Goods that I've heard. But they just went for it. And I just remember being there thinking, I've never heard anyone play with this much real sincerity and ferocity. And it was just, I mean, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but like everyone was just completely in the moment, and that's what it was, and nothing else mattered. So that song really was, all right, I'm sold. I understand 100% what everyone is saying.
And then the encore was My Soul, which you referred to earlier. You said that there were some people around you, or was this just in the general zeitgeist that some people just felt it was overplayed?
Yeah, I mean, that seemed to be the feeling, not with me or people directly around me, but after the fact, talking about, they're like, it was the My Soul Encore, which, they already played it, 1,000 times. So, like, they were writing it off, but I didn't heard it.
All right, so Chris, what do you remember about walking out of the show or after the show or getting to your car? Anything?
I remember we hung out front again, and I don't remember for how long, just talking with some of my friends. There were people like from my hometown that were there. So we were hanging out. I don't remember a ton about it, but I just remember driving home. My buddy Matt and my sister had a really fun argument about who was allowed to put their window up or down because one of them was freezing, the other was hot, and I was just trying to drive the car. And so knock it off. That is literally the only thing I remember about after the show.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming here, for doing this, for picking such an outstanding show, especially one that had a free soundboard recording available that could not have been better. And I appreciate you just taking the time out to talk about it. For anyone who is interested and needs a reminder, Chris's art is available for view and for purchase at Montroller, Montroller on Instagram. And apparently there's some sort of hidden Weebly website.
Yeah.
That his girlfriend may or may not have put together.
Yeah, but he hit me up on Instagram and we'll figure something out.
All right, Chris, thanks again so much. Take care.
Hey, thanks, Brian.
All right, everybody. That was Chris Casey talking about his first show, November 28th, 1997, at the Worcester Centrum. If you are interested in hearing the show, I would highly recommend going on fish.in. There is a beautiful, pristine soundboard recording available there for absolutely free. And now it's time for the fact check. The Worcester Centrum is currently known as the DCU Center, but for nostalgic purposes, I guess we'll just refer to it as the Worcester Centrum. When I asked Chris about its capacity, he guessed between 12,000 and 15,000. According to Wikipedia, the capacity is 14,800, so pretty close. He also mentioned the Cumberland County Civic Center. Chris guessed the capacity would be between 8 and 12,000. It is actually 9,500, so right in the middle. When we were talking about Cross-Eyed and Painless, about how many times Phish has teased it in its history, I thought that Cross-Eyed and Painless had to be the most teased song in history. It is not. According to Phish.net, it is the third most teased song in Phish history with 58 teases to date. In second place is San Jose by Freddie King with 61 teases, and Dave's Energy Guide in first with a whopping 148 teases. And I gotta admit, I still couldn't tell you what Dave's Energy Guide sounds like, even though I probably heard teases of it 100 times. Chris said that Phish, quote, played more shows in 1997 than any other year. That is off. They played more shows in 1997 than in any years since, but they played well over 81 shows in several years before 1997, especially in the early 90s. During our discussion of Theme from the Bottom, we had a little bit of back and forth about when it debuted. It did debut on May 16th, 1995 at the Lowell Voters for Choice Benefit Show. So I was right about that part, but I was wrong when I called it a new song in 1997. And finally, My Soul was not played in Mexico in 2020. At the time of this recording, it was last played at the Dunkin' Donuts Center, previously the Providence Civic Center, in Providence, Rhode Island, during the 2019 fall tour on November 29th, 2019. So again, thank you everybody for listening to today's episode of Attendance Bias. I'd like to thank Chris Casey for being our guest today. I'd like to thank Fish.in for providing such an amazing, pristine, solid recording of today's show. And I'd like to thank Fish.net for always providing the perfect amount of information that we need for our fact check and everything else. And if you enjoy Attendance Bias, please go on to iTunes or the Apple Podcast app and leave a rating and a review. Again, my name is Brian Weinstein. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.